Welcome, ladies and gentlemen. Dr. Jonathan Cook and I are back to discuss a great work of literature. And today's selection is Stephen Crane's The Red Badge of Courage. I forgot to tell you off camera right before we got this podcast started, Dr. Cook. I started in on Kurt Vonnegut's Slaughterhouse-Five. And right before I did that, one of the main characters, there's the insertion of the Red Badge of Courage when Billy Pilgrim finds himself in the psychiatric ward. So I couldn't help that there was some sort of synchronicity going on between the book I'm reading now and the book that I covered a couple weeks ago. And I was telling Dr. Cook that I got a chance to see a couple days ago is it John Huston or Houston? How do we say his name?
Oh, I don't know. Huston. I say Huston.
I say Houston, Huston, whatever. So yeah. I'm still working it out because I don't know all my great filmmakers saw that version of the Red Badge of Courage, the 1951. Apparently there's a 1974 version as well. I don't know. But yeah, there's so many things going on with Stephen Crane. We were talking earlier, there's this big influence that Stephen Crane had on Kubrick, which when Dr. Cook suggested that we cover the Red Badge of Courage, I was like, yeah, we got to do this. Not only did Crane influenced Kubrick when it came to his war epic, The Paths of Glory, but also a little story called The Blue Hotel that influenced The Shining. So that's why I'm excited to talk about Stephen Crane today. Why do you think the audience in general should be excited to talk about Stephen Crane? Why is he important for people today?
Well, to add to your list of signs of interest in Crane, I just was made aware of a new biography by Paul Auster, who's a well-known New York writer, and he's just published a 700-page biography of Crane. And it seems like there are new biographies out every couple of years. But anyway, I think Crane is a fascinating figure because there's such a lot of mystery about him. He had a short life, died at the age of 28, but he kind of made himself a modernist. I mean, his book Maggie, A Girl of the Streets, published in 1893, is considered often as the first naturalistic novel, which was the beginning of the movement that was, characterized Dreiser and Frank Norris and Jack London to a certain extent. So these are all people who really got their start in the 1890s or around the turn of the century. And Crane is, I often think of him in relation to Jack London because both of them were, there was a sort of an impersonality about the writing, about the idea of the force of nature. And, naturalism is based on the idea that nature and heredity control human destiny, that we really aren't in control of our fates, that these bigger forces shape us and often destroy us. And so, both Crane and Jack London often are depicting characters facing the elements. Stephen Crane, his famous story, The Open Boat. He's surviving a shipwreck. The character based on his experience. Red Badge of Courage. The environment there is sort of nature in its most cruel form, which is warfare, and the impersonality of war. Of nature during war is a frequent theme in war fiction or poetry. So Crane is an interesting figure because he really he just comes out of the blue. Not that well educated. Probably not that well read either, but he writes in the most original sort of poetic way about war, and people were just so impressed by Red Badge of Courage because it just seems so innovative stylistically, it sort of created a transition point between the 19th century moralistic fiction and 20th century sort of modernism, the idea of sort of civilization coming apart at the seams. And so, Crane's career covers pretty much the 1890s as a journalist and as a fiction writer. People forget often that he wrote a lot of potboilers. He had to make money as a writer. He had a very expensive life when he was living in England, when he went over later in the 90s and rented houses in southern England. And, he ended up entertaining a lot of people the last couple of years of his life, other writers who lived in the area like H.G. Wells, Conrad, even Henry James was a frequent guest. So, unfortunately, he had to sort of exploit his talent because he was pretty much a celebrity for Red Badge of Courage. But his style is really unique. Red Badge of Courage, every time you read it, you are just kind of impressed by the way the language describes the events of the story and the the landscape. Excuse me. Stylistically, he's writing in a way that is really intriguing. It's very, people describe it as impressionistic because it just sort of jumps from subject to subject and just gives you all kinds of interesting new points of view in very poetic language in a way that had not, writers hadn't been approaching, certainly not war stories in American literature. The best known novel of the Civil War, probably in the 1870s, was Miss Ravenel's Conversion, by John DeForest that we talked about. And that's a conventional war novel. It's a very great, personally, I like it as much as Red Badge of Courage. It has a completely different approach to the Civil War. It gives you all kinds of information about how the war started, the issue of slavery, the different campaigns that were going around in different parts of the country, a lot of it taking place in Louisiana and New Orleans. It gives you background information about, supply chains and provisioning, that kind of thing. So it really is a kind of panoramic view of the Civil War versus Crane, who is just focused on this one 3-day situation in an unnamed battle that people have identified as Chancellorsville in May of 1863. So anyway, that's a long drawn out explanation of why it's fun to pick up Crane every once in a while.
I have so many questions.
Yeah.
All right. Okay. So you say I don't know a lot about I've got a lot of different things going here. So forgive all these blind spots, but you say that Crane kind of came out of the clear blue. Like, get a little bit more of a background about how he was able to have this meteoric rise. Is it on talent alone? Was it connections? You mentioned that he was all mixed up with H.G. Wells and.
Well, that was later. He got to be a celebrity. No, he.
Well, I got some other questions I want to list off here.
Okay.
Secondly, something I've noticed by reading Slaughterhouse-5 and doing some of the background research for that, as that's the one I'm immersed in right now, is realizing how much Kurt Vonnegut's perception of Dresden, the firebombing of Dresden, actually affects people's perception of what actually happened at Dresden. And I'm curious, how much of what Crane is writing about the Civil War affected the perception of the Civil War, and if he is affecting perception, like of that conflict, and so he's writing. This came out in the 1890s.
1895, right? Yeah. So it's based 30 years after the end of the war.
So the So he would have been writing about a conflict that he had no direct participation in. So like, how did he put this all together?
Yeah.
And how accurate do we think it is?
Well, he he came from a well-educated family. His father was a Methodist minister who wrote books of theology. His mother was a Methodist reformer who was involved in the women's Christian temperance movement. So it's ironic that this very sort of atheistic son emerges out of a very devout family environment. But anyway, so he in his early years, I think when he was about 6 years old, he moved up with his family to Port Jervis, New York, which is kind of northwest. It's just at sort of the intersection of where New Jersey and New York State meet at the very top of New Jersey there. It's called Port Jervis. It's not on the Hudson River. It's about 40 minutes inland. So Port Jervis had a regiment, a 124th New York Regiment, had a bunch of veteran soldiers around who probably talked to Crane as a boy about their experiences. Crane also had a teacher at the Claverack college, which he went to in Claverack, New York, when he was in his mid-teens. He spent 2 years there from about 17, 18 years old. And, it was a military school because he thought he would go to West Point because he had some ancestors who were in the military. But then he got the advice that there wouldn't be any big wars coming up in, this is about 1888, 89. So, Crane thought, well, why should I go to West Point if there are not going to be any wars where I can get promotions, But one of the professors at Claverack Academy was an ex-officer in the Union Army who probably informed Crane a lot about his experiences. And then, last of all, when one of the reasons Crane started writing the book in spring of 1893, he was staying with a friend of his in New York, an artist named C.K. Linson. And Linson had around his apartment a magazine, Century magazine articles called "Leaders and Battles of the Civil War," and so Crane got immersed in these volumes, and his complaint was that there was no real personal feeling for combat. It was all kind of dry statistical information.
It's historical record. I read that whole. I read that whole thing. Well, all 4 volumes.
You were doing what Crane, that apparently was the reason he started writing. So he sat down starting in June of 1893 to April 1894. He started writing, staying with his brother in New Jersey when he was working as a freelance journalist at that point. So he had a lot of stories in his head that he'd heard about the war. He had factual data, and critics who've analyzed the basis for the story in the Battle of Chancellorsville show that he pretty much had a very accurate idea about Chancellorsville, and one of his brothers apparently knew a lot about the battle, so he probably talked to him. I mean, he was the 14th child of this huge family, although some of them died. But he had older brothers and sisters. He was the youngest child, so he stayed with his family members a lot, and he got information. One of his brothers was a journalist in New Jersey who got him work, so his brothers really helped him out quite a bit professionally, both in his work as a journalist and probably some information about the Civil War. So But other than that, Crane, he had spent one semester at Lafayette College in Easton, Pennsylvania, and then he spent the next semester at Syracuse University before he dropped out. So he had really a minimal college education. He was pretty much self-taught in a lot of ways, well read in literature and history, but was still with some big holes in his English literature background, because he didn't even start school until he was about 9 years old, and then he was kind of a lazy student. So he didn't. I mean, people knew he was smart, but he didn't tend to do well in school because he had no interest in certain subjects.
Well, he certainly made up for lost time. I mean, the creative output that he was able to do. But how did he die? 28 years old. How did he die?
He died of tuberculosis. He was kind of sickly for a lot of his life. He was very thin. I think he had health issues when he was a boy, so the tuberculosis eventually, caught up with him.
So when his productive output occurs between
was about 1892 to 1900. He died, in early the spring of 1900. But he's writing constantly because towards the latter years he's writing just to pay the bills, to pay the rent, the upkeep of his house. He was living with Cora, the ex-madam of a brothel in Florida, and he wasn't married to her. Henry James thought he was, but.
Is the Red Badge of Courage the only novel that we have from him?
No, he wrote other novels. He wrote a potboiler called The Third Violet that no one really reads or talks about. The third. Talks about? No one really. No critics talk about it. It's sort of a potboiler, but a lot of his journalism is worth reading. I mean, his works are out in 10 volumes from the University of Virginia. His collected works. So,
I have a handy little. It's not very. It's very thick, but it's not very big. Stephen Crane reader.
Yeah.
So and it has the Red Badge of Courage, and it has
Maggie,
Blue Hotel,
probably. Yeah.
The Open Boat and stuff like that. That's another reason why you folks should take an interest in Stephen Crane. I don't know if you knew this, Dr. Cook, but do you know he appears on the album cover for Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club by the Beatles?
Does he? Oh well.
Yes.
I'll have to look again.
Yeah, not only he's featured very prominently. He's he has a raised hand over Paul McCartney.
Oh, my Lord!
On Sgt. Pepper. So,
well, I feel a special kinship with him because he has my birthday.
Oh,
November 1st. So the only writer I know who has that birthday. So
interesting.
Yeah.
Makes me want to see
who
else.
I must channel him sometime to see if I can raise his ghost.
Oh, well, I don't know if I can encourage necromancy.
Huh.
So much time. Yeah. So what about the question I had about how much his? Well, I guess the question: how do we even know that he's writing about Chancellorsville? How do people, when it remains unnamed?
Yeah.
And I guess the thing is with fiction, and well, do we know how much he's affected our perception of what?
Well, that's a good question, because a lot of people who read him don't realize that he wrote the book. He was born after the Civil War. He had no battle experience. So people who just picked it up without knowing anything about him might well think that, yeah, of course he had to write this because it's so vivid.
Right.
He has such a.
That's what I thought. That's what I thought until I looked it up. I was like, wait a second.
Well, we know it's Chancellorsville for 2 or 3 reasons. One is, first of all, the 124th New York regiment. That was their first big battle, Chancellorsville. So the veterans would have mentioned that because it was very bloody and very humiliating for the Union. Pretty much a loss. In fact, if there was no Chancellorsville, there would be no Gettysburg. General Lee got the idea that he could invade the North because he thought these Union generals were such wusses, because Lee had half the size of Burnside's forces. And, Burnside famously boasted that he said, God must have mercy on General Lee because I certainly won't. And then he, bungled the battle, and then had to retreat and lost a lot of men. But anyway, second reason that we know it's Chancellorsville is that Crane wrote a story called The Veteran, which involved an older Henry Fleming. People don't, usually read this or know about it, talking about the Battle of Chancellorsville. And third of all, if you look at the description of where the unit in the story is going, it matches what's going on with probably the 3rd Corps, which is on the right wing of this battle. It was fought along the Rappahannock, down near the Wilderness. I mean, there was it's down towards Fredericksburg. A year later, there was the Wilderness Campaign, which is incredibly bloody, fought around the same area. So, Battle of Chancellorsville, named after a little courthouse in just south of the Rappahannock there. And you can match up some of the events in the story, crossing the river, which is the Rappahannock. In fact, the Rappahannock River is mentioned, and the soldiers that Henry Fleming encounters fleeing when he's kind of AWOL at this point because he's run away from the battle and he's hanging out with a bunch of Union men, wounded Union men. They hear all these soldiers rushing, asking, "Where's the Plank Road?" Where the Plank Road? Kind of in a funny accent. Well, that turns out it's probably the German-American troops that were under General Oliver Howard, who were the 11th Corps, who were on the right wing, and they had bungled their move, and their soldiers were fleeing, and this was symptomatic of the fact that the battle was going in favor of the Confederates. In fact, General Jackson encircled the Union. He kind of, if you're looking north and south, he kind of circled around to the left and came around from behind, and that was probably the final battle that ended in the Union defeat at this point. Of course, Jackson was killed accidentally after Chancellorsville. He was out on reconnaissance, riding with an aide, and one of his own soldiers shot him in the arm, and he was wounded and then died of pneumonia, I think, about 3 days later. So, even though the battle was won by the Confederates, they lost one of their best generals. If you want to know all about how the book compares to the events of Chancellorsville, there's a book called Private Fleming at Chancellorsville by a guy who teaches out in Ohio, and that's the definitive account of the historical basis for the novel at Chancellorsville. And the first article about this was published in 1963. So it's been known for a while, but of course, anyone who wants to immerse themselves in the minute accounts of these battles, can always pick up a detail or two, and that's what this guy did when he published his book, Henry Fleming at Chancellorsville.
That It's quite the quite the detective's hat the guy put on to figure that out. What's his name again?
Well, the original guy in 1963. Just one sec here. I'm checking. If you don't mind, I'm sorry.
That's okay.
I
can tell you who you have birthdays with.
Huh.
Tim Cook of Apple.
Oh, really?
Edward Said.
Oh, okay.
Who else? There's a rapper, little peep, little beep.
Little Bo Peep. Okay, that's good to know.
Yeah.
Okay, so this guy is named Perry Lentz, Lentz, and his book came out in 2006. So, you probably get a used copy cheap. But it's the definitive historical account of this, how the Civil War battle of Chancellorsville provides the basis for this novel. But I think
does anyone speculate why Crane was preoccupied with Chancellorsville? Did he just throw a dart and say, "Oh, well, it's a good place today to write a story"?
I think it's because he heard about it from these New York veterans when he was a boy, so it stuck in his mind. His brother, one of his brothers, I think it was Edmund, was an authority on the battle, and I think too it went with the idea of irony. I mean, the Red Badge of Courage is just filled with all kinds of ironies, including the title. The badge, of course, is a badge of dishonor that he that he has because of his fleeing from the original battle. The irony is just it pervades Chancellorsville because the boast of Burnside, about the fact that he's going to whip Lee, and so for someone who it just shows the vicissitudes of battle that you can have an army twice the size of the Confederates and still end up losing. So it's a representative battle from the first half of the war, in that the North lost a lot of these battles because of bad generalship. I don't know. I mean, it's if it was a war story with the Union performing brilliantly and the Confederates being repulsed and whatnot, I mean, it wouldn't have been appropriate for the sort of ambiguities and moral uncertainties of the story that we have, I think. So I think it was an appropriate battle because it was a Union defeat and showed a certain amount of hubris in Burnside, and the confusion of war was very evident because no one can really figure out why the battle was lost. I mean, military historians are trying to assess, who exactly screwed up, and they still don't know for sure. But Burnside undercut himself because he sent his cavalry. They're supposed to be used for reconnaissance. He sent them on an expedition south before the battle actually took place. So the battle itself, the book itself, goes from April 30th to May 3rd, pretty much. So it's the beginning of May. You can sort of plot the number of days by when you read the book. But the events on April 30th is when they hear about the fact they might be moving, and then they march, and then the next morning they're actually fighting. Then Henry Fleming, flees. Then he spends a night. Later that day, he gets back to his regiment. The next day, he fights and then spends the night. And the next morning, they're marching, pretty much, I think, in retreat on a rainy day. So all of these facts match up pretty closely with what this New York regiment would have been doing historically during that time period.
So are historians generally, uh, do they generally look upon the Red Badge of Courage favorably in its depiction of the Civil War, or do they?
I think, I don't think they use it as evidence for anything, obviously, because it's not a direct testimony for. No, I think I don't really know what historians think about it. I mean, I think they consider it a classic work of fiction that shows war from a certain angle of a teenager who doesn't know what the hell is going on. I mean, that's another thing that people comment on, is that these soldiers have no idea what's going on. They're asking questions about what they're going to be doing, where they are. They don't know exactly where they are. They don't know what the strategy is. They're just there to follow command, and they don't have any opinions on politics or slavery or whatever. It's all just surviving one day to the next.
That's probably done by design.
Yeah.
Gotta keep them disoriented.
Yeah.
Can't can't have an effective killing machine knowing all of that.
Yeah. Well, you don't want soldiers thinking too much when you're telling them to kill other people.
Exactly. Which, I mean, if we want to elaborate a little bit more on how this, how Crane uses Henry Fleming to illustrate this. Yeah, I think you alluded to it already. He and several others are kind of clueless about a lot of things.
Yeah, I mean, I think the whole novel just teaches that, reality can be seen from all kinds of points of view, and none of them can be the definitive, accurate one. I mean, that's why they call Crane kind of an impressionist, because he's painting these pictures of war that are just sort of impressions, and they're not supposed to be definitive truths. Because, I mean, pretty much you're in the mind of Henry Fleming, who was just taking it all in, and can't really, decide what he thinks in the end. That's why when people criticize the end of the book, when he, the narrator talks about Henry becoming a man and everything, I think that is sort of Henry's own mind speaking to itself. I mean, or it's Crane offering a sop to the general reader, writing a book where people would get a satisfying conclusion so he could sell books. But he left it ambiguous whether it was really true or not, because obviously you can't become a man, in 3 days of slogging around on the battlefields of the Civil War. It takes a lot more than that. So there's irony wherever you look in the book, and you can't take everything at face value. But what I love about the book, too, is that there's a certain amount of kind of black comedy going on. And what I particularly love is the Crane's imagery relating to the artillery and the guns, because every once in a while you have this description of the artillery going by, whizzing by, and then getting set up and getting involved in like an oratorical contest, or having the guns sitting there like Indian chieftains pointing in a certain direction. So he personifies these lumbering artillery pieces in a way that is quite amusing. He brings them kind of alive, as though they're kind of speaking to each other from different sides of the battlefield, or they have a surly air. He spoke with a surly air. So it's all this personification and symbolism that I love about the book, and including the idea that, in some ways there's sort of a child's imagination here, because he talks about the dragons, the idea that he's going to be fighting dragons, so the other army is this monstrous dragon-like beast that he's going to be facing. So it's almost like a fairy tale world that mixes up the what comes into the mind of a young man at that point, or really a boy.
Yeah, I'll never get over. I mean, I'll never get over how, men from bordering states were able to slaughter each other in such numbers. I mean, what does it tell us about how they could perceive their potential blood relations as like these monsters that had to be subdued when they were so
Yeah.
similar, and a lot of these guys didn't have a vested interest in even the things that they were fighting for, you know? It's not like
Yeah, well, that's why in the book, you have Henry Fleming talking to the Confederate picket on the other side of the river, which of course is the Rappahannock River. Having a conversation, and the Confederate saying, "You're a right good man, Yank." Having this friendly conversation, and then describing the Confederates as sharpshooters as, shooting as though they didn't really want to be doing what they're doing, but just for the hell of it, So yeah, I mean, there was all kinds of fraternization going on, directly, indirectly, but of course they had to, line up for battle when they were ordered to. And I think it was, there was all kinds of demonization of the enemy going on, mistreatment of prisoners, so you could hate the other army if you knew that they were, torturing prisoners in places like Libby and Andersonville, or you knew that they were, this horrific rebel yell they had, where they sounded like screaming banshees. So, it was easy to demonize the enemy when you experienced some of the horrors of war. But yeah, they were, one country divided at that point.
Yeah, still mystifies me. I guess I had to be there. The more I learned about the Civil War, the harder it is for me to comprehend how it happened.
Well, I tell you, it's if you know about slavery and the fact that it was on the move, it was expanding, and it was making tons of money for Southerners. That's why you understand why the oligarchs of the South wanted civil war, because they didn't want Yankees messing with the spread of slavery. They thought that they should be able to bring their slaves anywhere, and they didn't the North telling them they couldn't. And
no, I understand that.
Yeah.
I understand the people at the top.
Yeah. The soldiers, yeah.
Yeah, I'm just to actually get the soldiers to kill each other.
Yeah.
That's the part that still baffles me. So, I could understand if the oligarchs and they want to fight each other. That's fine. But
Union soldiers, they fought for the restoration of the Union. They didn't necessarily fight for the end of slavery, but they had this idealized idea, about the integrity of the Union and the fact that the South was not legally allowed to do what they were doing. So tell me, when you were reading the book, did you have to sort of pause after every paragraph to kind of absorb the kind of violence of the presentation, or the kind of scattershot descriptions of everything that were being thrown at you? Because there's a lot of poetic language that is embodied in one sentence and doesn't carry over to the next sentence. He's kind of these very forceful thrusts of descriptive language.
I don't know if I have. I'm somewhat. I don't want to say desensitized, but I mean it's not something that I'm unfamiliar with. Like I said, I've been kind of. I don't know how much I elaborated on this at the very beginning, but I've been knee deep in. I was doing this the same time that I was doing a lot of research on Paths of Glory, Cobb's novel, and that got adapted by Kubrick with Kirk Douglas.
Yeah.
So I was kind of in the zone. I think to appreciate it. It didn't give me as much pause.
Yeah.
It kind of just.
Yeah.
I kind of just went with it. So,
Yeah.
Not that I shouldn't. That's the thing about the way that I consume. I consume a lot
Yeah.
of books, and so you know, there's something to be said maybe for more qualitative experiences. What I'm doing, I there's a research project that I'm working on, so I'm just constantly tearing through material. Uh, I imagine if I didn't have those self-imposed deadlines, I probably would maybe appreciate some of these nuances a little bit more.
Well, I think
You
that
know,
Red Badge of Courage is you definitely have to read it more than once to really get into it, and to
you've
appreciate its
you've probably taught it.
subtleties. Yeah, I
You've probably
taught
taught
it.
it. So,
Yeah, I don't think it wasn't a huge hit with students, but I think it is something that they probably want to go back to later and reread. Um, uh, so
did you? I didn't ask you. Did you by chance see the 1974
no, I
uh,
haven't. I haven't.
the one that they did? I didn't know if you had any feelings about that.
No, no. I'm
Um,
I'm always wary about looking at classic fiction in movie form, just because so few adaptations honor the spirit of the writer, and they're more often a vehicle for the director or the whoever's adapting it to put their little original spin on the material. Anyway, that's another matter.
no. I think it's an interesting matter. I have. It's I find it interesting. The discrepancies sometimes infuriate me, but the discrepancies also sometimes make me question about if there's something that's being communicated by specifically eliminating something or adjusting it somehow. Um, I think we were talking about. I mean, just I mentioned The Shining or whatever. There's a big difference between like just the feud between King and Kubrick over the Shining is very intriguing to me. And that whole psychological dynamic. So I don't necessarily view it with disgust all the time. I think there's
Yeah,
sometimes
yeah.
there's
Well,
something very the discrepancies are very intriguing sometimes.
yeah,
So I have to say though, that the the as much as I enjoyed the Houston movie, it's definitely not true
yeah, yeah,
to the text. So
yeah,
it's kind of got things flip flopped. So
yeah.
um, so we had some controversy with Crane, huh? Uh,
Over what?
over the religious or the
Religious
mythological, but
aspects?
yeah.
Yeah, yeah. Well, it's not such a big deal now, but a guy named Stallman, who wrote a major biography in the '60s, was coming out and claiming that of course, um, the what's his name, Jim. Um, character's Jim. I'm drawing up
Yeah.
his name. His last name begins with a C, so JC. The idea
Is
is
it Conklin? Is it Conklin?
Conklin. Yeah, Jim
Yeah.
Conklin. He and actually that's the name of a soldier in the 124th uh, infantry from New York that Crane knew from Port Jervis. Anyway, Jim Conklin, his death, famous death where he's shot on the side, he dies, and the last line of the chapter 9 is the red sun looked like a wafer pasted in the sky. So the idea is, this is kind of the death of Jesus Christ, and he's atoning for the sins of Henry Fleming's cowardice or something, and that Crane is putting a little religious reference in the idea of a communion wafer in the sky. Well, it turns out that artillery used things that were called wafers to ignite the powder. So that's one possible, resonance for the image. But the fact is, the book is filled with all kinds of references to God and God's and the red god, the bloated god of war, the red animal. And he visits a chapel of death with the Union soldier there after he flees the battlefield. So the landscape of the book is really mythological. And I read an interesting article that compared the Iliad to Red Badge of Courage. And Crane, mentions Homer in the beginning of the book, Homeric struggles. So it's clear that Henry Fleming probably read the Iliad, and Stephen Crane certainly did. Iliad has 24 books to it. Red Badge of Courage has 24 books. Both, the Iliad is pretty much about Achilles. He's moping in his tent because his friend Patroclus has been killed. I'm sorry, he's moping because his mistress has been taken away, and then his friend Patroclus is killed, so he emerges from his taking time off from fighting, and he engages Hector, and that's the big battle of the Iliad. So the idea of malingering, of taking time off from battle, you have Henry Fleming who does the same thing. He withdraws from the battle because of, in this case, of fear. I mean, there's not a lot of direct associations here. It's more in terms of the imagery, the sort of mythological references to God and gods that characterizes this novel as a sign of its Homeric legacy there. So that's an interesting comparison. I mean, there's no direct analogy in terms of sourcing, but he's certainly, I think, invoking the idea of battle that begins with the Greeks and the Trojan War. So you read the book. I mean, even though Crane was the son of two very devout Methodists, you cannot say that he had an ounce of religious feeling in him. He befriended prostitutes in New York City. I mean, he had a feeling for the underdog, certainly. Like Jack London, he went underground and pretended to be a bum and wrote it up as an experience in a newspaper article, just like Jack London wrote up a whole book about it, about the English, the London unemployed, called People of the Abyss. So Crane, you cannot say he was religious at all. So I think it's no coincidence that Jim Conklin is JC and there's a wafer in the sky, but you can't really make any sustained religious analogies. Although I was thinking the other day that, Crane is sort of reproducing the idea of original sin, the idea of the felix culpa, the blessed fault that in Christianity, the felix culpa means, Adam sinned in paradise and fell, but then that enabled Jesus Christ to come along and rescue all of us with his atoning crucifixion. So, in a way, Henry Fleming embodies that idea of the felix culpa, in that his act of running from battle is the grounds for his redemption, because when he comes back to join his unit after fleeing from battle, no one knows that he ran from that engagement. They are ignorant of that, so he can reaffirm himself confidently, and then happens to be in the battle the next day and grabs the colors, the flag of the unit, to carry forward. So he kind of redeems himself from his disgrace because no one knows about it, But he wouldn't have been enabled to do what he does on the second day of battle if he hadn't screwed up and run from the battle on the first day. So I don't know. You could consider that maybe a Christian motif, but it's not very overt in the book.
It's okay. I'm okay with subtle. Okay with subtle.
Yeah. I mean, it's interesting because Crane's father was a Methodist, minister who wrote a well-known book of theology that got him in trouble because it wasn't towing the line of the Methodist Church. So, but he was very, an accomplished religious thinker who died.
What was so
early.
Controversial about
I think he was sort of poo-pooing the idea of instant conversions. He was proposing the idea of sort of Christian nurture, of not having some definitive moment where you get Jesus, which was not necessarily what the Methodists wanted to hear, because a lot of their activity involved camp meetings. They built the camp meeting centers in Asbury Park, New Jersey, and if you go to Martha's Vineyard, Edgartown in Martha's Vineyard, Vineyard Haven has all these beautiful little kind of toy houses around and a big park, and that was actually a Methodist meeting area, summer meetings, for these prolonged religious get-togethers.
I just pulled up something here. I found a little journal. I guess it's was it the Holiness Movement? Was that what it's called?
Christian Holiness. Yeah.
Interesting.
So Methodism though was definitely one of the very strong denomination at the time in the later 19th century. Methodists and Baptists were the biggest denominations.
That's what I was raised. Good old Methodist.
Methodist, yeah, okay.
Yeah. Not that I could really tell you what all the doctrines were that I was raised with.
Well, it was a sense of holiness. I mean, sort of a bit of influenced by the Mennonites and the Hutterites and the some of those more mystical sects that came over to the U.S. from Germany, that also believed in the kind of love fest, get-togethers and revivals, anyway, that's another field.
I should dig further into it. If I could just find I could confidently say that that's the denomination I ought to return to, but finding a church has been interesting.
Yeah.
So what about this Henry becoming a real man? Finally.
Yeah.
Stares down the battle and tastes it. Becomes real.
Yeah, I take it with
man.
a grain of salt. I mean, I think it's more of him talking to himself when the narrator writes that. I don't, there's no sort of Hollywood ending to the book. The soldiers are trudging off in the rain. There's a little sunny glimpse at the end, but I think Crane is pretty much trying to keep his readers happy by not having a totally absurdist ending. I mean, he's sort of turning towards the conventional ending because you have to create a sense of climax somehow. It's a novel that has a very complete structure to it. I read a good article about how it embodies the what's called the monomyth of the hero, who goes out on their own, is initiated, and then comes back to return with the wisdom of the that he's learned along the way.
You've been dipping into the Joseph Campbell,
yeah.
Is that where you got that, the monomyth?
Yeah. Well, there's a good article on that topic, and there's interesting, parallels between the stages of the myth and the helpers of the myth. I mean, for instance, the tattered man that helps Henry.
Right.
No, I'm sorry, not the tattered man. Is trying to help him, and then there's the cheery man. So these are two nameless soldiers who kind of weird, impersonal helpers to Henry to, first of all, to get him to, explain himself and find out what he's doing there and ask where he's wounded. Of course, Henry hates this because he's not wounded. He's there with the wounded men without a wound, and then he accidentally gets a wound after he starts, haranguing another wounded soldier who hits him over the head with the butt of his rifle. So these are sort of mythological helpers midway through the story. I would advise anyone who's interested in that topic to just look up the article on, the Red Badge of Courage as a monomyth.
I'll tell you what about this whole monomyth thing, Joseph Campbell. I recently got through Finnegan's Wake. Not that I understood any of it.
Yeah.
But I much more. I went back and did Portrait of an Artist. that I really enjoyed. But
yeah, Finnegan's Wake. You need to read books about how to interpret it.
Yeah. Well, what I didn't realize is that Joseph Campbell really cut his teeth and got famous
on Finnegan's Wake.
By writing a book called The Skeleton's Key to Finnegan's Wake. I don't know if I'll get around to reading it. I'll have to determine how much I want to master Finnegan's Wake. But I am very interested in at least understanding what Campbell's project is, the Hero of Thousand Faces, because this seems to be affecting everything, whether consciously or unconsciously.
Yeah.
I don't know if you've ever read this other book too. It's like the 7 plot lines.
I have a copy of it actually. I haven't read it. It's on my list.
I heard it before. I heard it like back in college, but I was like, I'm getting to the point where I'm seeing enough similarities and crossovers between all the stuff that I'm consuming that I'm like, what was it that I once heard that there's only like 7 plot lines? So
yeah, it's a hefty book though.
It is a hefty book. I don't. Yeah. We'll see if I can get through it. We'll see. Well,
Crane and
modern academia.
Modern academia.
What's the assessment?
Well, I mean, the book has been in print ever since it was published. He's maintained his reputation. It's still taught. As a white male writer about war, I don't think lots of people rush to read it in their college English courses, but I think let me see. In my survey course in American literature, we did not read it, but I think any course in the literature of war, Civil War history sometimes reads it. So yeah, I mean it hasn't been totally disrespected as a classic. I think the fact that Crane was an anti-imperialist. He wrote sympathetically about African Americans in a book called in a novella called The Monster. The book can be viewed as sort of an anti-war novel. I think he, politically he stands in good stead with people who are critical of manifestations of the worst sides of American culture and history. So you can't blame him for, he's not, or Teddy Roosevelt writing, celebrations of the Rough Riders or anything. Although he did know Teddy Roosevelt. Roosevelt admired Red Badge of Courage, but he was certainly on the other anti-imperialist camp from Roosevelt, and wrote some, critical journalism about the Spanish-American War, which he covered as a journalist. So I think he has a respected but not totally secure place in the American canon, in today's academia.
Well, I mean, I'm uncovering a lot of things that lead back to him. I mentioned the Kubrick connections, the Beatles connection. I suppose I'm going to uncover a lot more. Well, I think there's a lot more to this Crane figure. if Kubrick and the Beatles are so fixated with him, then something tells me there's something big going on with Mr. Stephen Crane.
Yeah. Well, I think he's not well known as he should be. This new biography of Paul Auster, I think, is an attempt to get more people to dust off their volumes of Crane. The Library of America has a good one-volume collection of his major work, and he wrote a book of poetry as well. So, I mean, he's one of those authors that you don't have to spend your lifetime reading him because he died at 28. So that's
still, very prolific. Consider.
Yeah.
I'm trying to think what I had done by 28.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I know.
It's kind of wow. How is he able to do it? How are any of them able to do it? I always feel so inadequate. But anyway, hopefully our discussion of Crane today will get people to be part of the resurgence. And
yeah, well, he started young. He wrote fiction as a boy and then a teenager, and then he started writing Maggie, a Girl of the Streets, and is about 20 or 21. So he because he didn't finish college, he had a head start to be a writer.
What made him want to be a writer if he hadn't really done a lot of fancy book learning? Do we know why?
I just think he was consumed with a vision of the world as sort of chaotic and unknowable, and he had a kind of poetic sensibility that made his use of language interesting, and he had an affinity for artists. He spent some time living with an artist in New York City when he was finishing Red Badge of Courage. So people talk about the coloration of his books. All his books have colors in their titles, like Red Badge of Courage or Blue Hotel or The Bride Comes to Yellow Sky or the Third Violet. Anyway,
did he ever explicitly state anyone that was an influence on him, or that he admired, or that he was deeply steeped in, or do we get a sense of who he
read? Not really.
He just had this ability.
He had this ability. Yeah, I mean, he was reading Howells in the 1870s. I mean, it'd be interesting. I don't think he read DeForest's Miss Ravenel's Conversion, but I'm not really sure. I mean, it's a lot of his early life is very spotty. We don't have a lot of data on it. So there's no Crane, library sitting somewhere. I think there's I mean, there's a volume of letters, but not a lot of other data for his early life.
Well, a mystery hopefully someone will resolve one day. I think we've been going for about an hour here, Dr. Cook. Is there anything else you'd like to say in closing?
No,
or?
I think we covered enough, and quite a bit.
I think so too. I want to thank everybody for listening. I want to thank Dr. Cook for joining me again, and we'll chat for a little bit and maybe think about what we want to do next time. Okay. Take care, everyone. Bye-bye.